Okay, I'm going to review week 5, and we're going to be going into the final week. So I'm going to try to really zero in on how to help you think differently and improve so that you can get a grade that you want. I want you to look at this picture very carefully, or the 3 pictures here, and think about what's the first thing that comes to your mind about what do they have in common. I want you to write that thing down or put it in your phone, whatever you think. The answer is to what do these 3 things in common, and then I want you to put next to that, either write it down or put it in your phone, put system. So whatever your answer is equals system. So look at the pictures, what comes to mind, what's the thing that they each have in common, and then write down system. Now, the whole reason I'm getting you to start thinking about systems is that you mostly are still focusing on individuals. So those of you who did the annotation and the readings, you thought or talked about racism as an individual thing. You talked about sexism as an individual thing. You talked about hearsay as a neutral evidence rule, and then a judge on an individual basis doesn't apply the rule equally. So you're still focusing on individuals, of which you have no knowledge of individual behavior. So that is itself hearsay. You don't have direct knowledge of the thing that you're trying to prove. So I want you to try to get out of this habit of trying to read people's minds when you don't have any information to prove what it is you think that they're doing. Instead, this is a legal system class, right? That's the name of the class, legal system. So you need to see that racism is system. It's not an individual act. It targets African Americans using the law. The historical legacy of that goes back to the Atlantic slave trade and dehumanizing people from Africa in order to get economic gain and the benefits that come from that for white men. That's what makes it racist. That's that system. For those of you who are still unsure whether that system still exists, a good person to YouTube is Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow. There's also a documentary called The 13th, which will help you better understand that the system still exists. Of course it still exists because it hasn't changed, right? Nobody's changed this system. You'd have to have a majority of the people would have to decide to change this system. You'd have to have a new constitution. You'd have to have a new economic system. And so clearly that hasn't happened. And so we are still living in a racist system. And it's a historical system, meaning that it didn't start yesterday. It's been around for a long time, and it continues to benefit a large number of people, and that's why most people don't go against it. The same thing can be said with sexism. It's a system that benefits white men using the law, and they've done this, white men did this again historically, so they kept women out. It took women organizing and a majority of the population agreeing that that moderate system, that reform, so thinking about power there should be a reform to the system. So it stays racist, it stays as economically disadvantaging large groups of people, but it's no longer excluding women. Women are now allowed to come into the system. That's a modification, a reform of the system. And then mobilization of this biased system towards white men, historically designed to do that, excludes not just people, but also norms, ways that people exist in their everyday lives. And so when you get to court, you're being asked to get rid of everything that you understand about your own existence and really just operate within this world of white men, elite, wealthy, cultural values. And so this is a system that is biased against all other types of behaviors. And so this is, I'm going to keep saying this over and over again, system, not individuals. And so I did a trick question here because I really wanted to try to prove this point and help you get in. Look at the division of answers here. When the actual answer I slid in after you took the quiz is that you should have been able to see from the reading here that what he's saying in this article is it says Roof's crime cannot be divorced from the ideology of white supremacy. So this whole system, the bias system, is based on the concept that white people are better than other people. That's what we mean by white supremacy, supreme, right? So the white man's laws, the ones that he writes, the ones that he enforces, those are supreme. So when you use that language of the Constitution as the supreme law, you're repeating a byproduct of white supremacy. It's founded on a hierarchy that some things are better or worse than other things. And so this is an example of the narrative of white supremacy as rooted in the US legal system, that it comes through it. You'll hear people say, well, I have the right to protect myself, I have the right to a gun, right? All these rights that come from this system, from this historical system. And so I'm trying to get you now to look at the system, not individual behavior. So the system is what's biased, not only individuals. So all human beings are biased towards their preferences, towards their experiences, towards their values. This is obvious, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people being biased towards a system, and to be biased towards a system meaning that you either get benefits from that system and so you keep working with the system because you want to keep getting those benefits, or you think you might get the benefits in the future and so you keep working and working even though you're getting harmed by the system. You're hoping that someday you'll get the benefits because you see other people getting it, or you don't realize that you're being harmed by the system and you go along with things, or you're afraid that there's going to be consequences if you go against the system and so you keep going with it, or you actively go against the system. You resist the system, you try to change the system. So law is a system constructed socially, right? It doesn't exist outside of human beings bringing it together and acting. Think about like a theater, right? You're going in, the movie exists for you when you start watching it. Law exists for people when they start using it and interacting with each other. It doesn't exist outside of human beings. It's not sitting somewhere in a box ready for people to open it. And it's the mobilization of bias. So all the biases in the system get mobilized, meaning they move forward, move forward, move forward, and then they get put together by the people who are in control of that system, who have the benefits. In this case, it's white men, because that's who they gave themselves the power, they gave themselves the dominant authority in the United States Constitution. It's also that group of people were and continue to be today upper middle class people who are protecting the economic system, and that economic system is property. And so upper middle class people have property, and then, as you know, the wealthy, the rich, the elites, however you want to say that, the industrialists, the capitalists, they have the most property. And so people in the middle class tend to think that they might get some property, and so they support the system. That's all participating in the mobilization of bias against people who are black, Latino, women, poor or working class, or have different norms than the prevailing norm. So if your sexuality is different than the prevailing norm, if your religion is different than the prevailing norm, if you talk differently than people in the prevailing norm, if you have abilities that are different than people in the prevailing norm, the system is all mobilized against you. And so we call those minoritized populations because they become minoritized from the system. They're not born unequal, they're made unequal through the system. And so you see two examples of this. You have in All Eyes Are on You, women are having to work harder by writing longer opinions and citing more cases because that's the value system, that's the norm system, and the expectation is that women don't know what they're doing, and so they have to prove to their male peers that they're equal. This is the same thing that's going on in the Fire This Time by Charles Lawrence. He's showing you that people are having to go to the streets, they're having to represent their interests, they're having to fight back because they're being dehumanized. So this is the struggle they're going through. These are two pieces of evidence that help you see that the system is biased, not only individuals. So again, the system is biased, not just individuals. I hope you're saying that with me now so that you do better on the final exam. So you want to think about it in this case as hearsay is not a neutral rule. It looks like a neutral rule, right? It says, look, the evidence has to be excluded. It's not going to be allowed. So think of like the anonymous tip that would never get into court, right? It's a lovely thing on TV, but it doesn't get into the courtroom. It's not reliable because the truth about the matter was not directly observed or known by the witness. And so the person is talking about something that they didn't directly evidence and can't prove that they have reliable testimony about. Now, however, right, so that sounds neutral, but in the mobilized bias system where women are discriminated against, where African Americans are discriminated against, where the working class is discriminated against, and people are struggling against that societal dehumanization, their testimony is not always believed the same way. So you have on one hand, one witness in the Trayvon Martin situation has extremely good evidence, very valuable evidence. It's not being taken seriously. It's not that it's hearsay, it's not hearsay. It's very relevant to the case at hand. It was directly known to her, but they're not taking her seriously because at times she's speaking in African American English, at times she's being intimidated, at times she's being disrespected, at times she's being harmed. And so this asks the question, why even have people testify at all if they're not allowed to be themselves and to give truthful, honest testimony? Now, that's a rhetorical question, because on the other hand, look what we have here. We have a white, rich male who not only gets to use the court system for a very petty reason. It's not even really, it's very petty reasons, just to satisfy his own indulgences, but he gets to make jokes about it in the middle of the courtroom, and nobody really, takes that as a reason not to trust him or not to believe him. In fact, he got lots of laughs and things like that in the courtroom. And so you see how the mobilization of bias towards white men works out in an actual case situation. So the sad part is most of you are still not getting it. So if I look at your answers, you're still talking about law as if it's one thing that's in a box that I go unpack and then it helps everybody and solves everybody's problems. It's even kind of stranger because you're making it sound like, look at the problem here. On the one hand, you're saying that law stops people from doing bad things, but then you're talking about people doing bad things. So it obviously doesn't stop people from doing bad things. It doesn't restrict violence. It doesn't get people to follow the rules. It doesn't do any of these things. And so I think you're still trying to talk about law as punishment, which they're two different words. And so you want to start thinking about law as much more complicated and much more complex than how you're talking about it, and really stop moving away from this idea that it's one thing and that it's outside of reality. Again, you're focusing on the psychology of individuals. You don't have direct knowledge of that information, so you really need to stop judging individuals and start looking at the system and predicting what's going to happen based on that system. So all people are biased towards a system, not just biased in general. So you want to always think about who benefits from this system, who's benefiting from the system, who's in charge of the system, who gets treated better in the system, and then who's being excluded, who gets treated worse, who's suffering, who's getting targeted. That tells you what the bias is, who's it biased for and who's it biased against. Stop talking about bias just like it's psychology. It's not. White male judges are empowered in this system because of the bias. And that's the general bias in society in our unequal social relations of white men who hold positions of power in multiple areas of our society, and specifically within the legal arena, in being a judge, being a lawyer, being a politician. And so that's reproduced, and then that empowers other white men. All judges are constrained by professional norms, meaning there's rules that they have to follow in the profession. They're also constrained in their decision making by appeals, right? They could be overruled. They also want to try to impress other judges. They want to try to make sure that their decision is going to be upheld. They also have a law school education, so they're socialized and they're constrained through that experience. And then also how precedents are being argued by the opposing lawyers. Judges can't just make things up. They use the material that lawyers put in front of them. And so they're biased, but they're not unlimited bias, right? They don't get to do whatever they want. They're not making every single decision, right? And specifically, they're making decisions on matters of law, usually having to do with evidence, like we were talking about whose evidence or what piece of evidence or what testimony is going to be heard, how is it going to be presented, etc. Interpretation is always going to be there. Everyone is always interpreting. You're interpreting this video as I'm making for you right now. That itself does not show bias, right? Interpretation is something that humans do that makes us amazing. We're better than other animals in that regard, right? They aren't able to have multiple interpretations and, write plays and movies and stories about these things. So, you got to try to start getting to this working it out area where you're moving away from wanting. I can understand why you want law to be this thing. You want it to be one thing that automatically punishes all people and makes everybody equal all the time. It sounds lovely. It's completely, ridiculous. It's never going to happen. And so you need to start moving that groups of people hold power. They have positions, they have authority, and that creates unequal social relations. And that has been constructed. That's not natural. That's how human beings in America, and white men in particular, have designed a system to benefit them and to hurt other people. And so that's the bias, that's the mobilization of bias. You want to start to see then there's going to be different points of view about what the legal system is based on whether you're being empowered or you're being harmed. And then you also want to think about, I've tried to give you lots of different readings and experiences where you can start to see this over and over and over again, so you start putting the pieces together. So this is a nearly perfect answer. I'll say it's a perfect answer. I think it is a perfect answer. So this student has gone through 4.5 weeks of work and has come to the you got it, right? They're now at this place where they have put the pieces together and they understand these pieces in a very complex way. And so you might want to think about what they're saying here. You might want to think about how they're centering on unequal power relationships, how they're thinking about the diversity of experiences as contrasted to the idea of laws being one thing, showing how law can change and take on different meanings over time and how it affects people differently, and how they're able to take their knowledge from the course. So sometimes you think that if you say the wrong thing, right, you give like a D answer, but then you quote to like Dr. Chapman's article, all that shows me is you didn't really understand the article, right? So that keeps you in the D range. Just citing to a piece of work from the class, but not applying it correctly, right, that's not an A answer. Using the concepts from those readings and applying them, that does show me that you're getting it. So in this last week leading up to the final exam, I'm trying to help you by putting all the pieces together for you, making it as clear as I possibly can from my own words, and trying to get you to think about these concepts deeply. Then I'm going to kind of quiz you here. I'm going to give you a critical reading. Somebody's going to be pointing out the flaws in the common understanding, what people think about the case of Marbury versus medicine. If you go to YouTube, if you click on Google, you're going to get a bunch of wrong answers. Some of you are always tempted to copy and paste those answers. Believe me, I can tell when you've done so. The problem with this particular case is those answers are wrong. And so this author is going to tell you why they're wrong. And they're going to show you what Marshall did and how Marshall invented a power that didn't exist in the Constitution. It wasn't known at the time. It doesn't exist in England. It didn't exist at the time then either. And so it's an amazing thing that this error has led to this concept that you would find in an American government textbook as some kind of novel, ingenious invention, when it was a mistake or a lie, if you want to accuse him of lying. And so then I want you to read the case and find the lie. Show where he makes the mistake, where Justice Marshall makes the wrong interpretation and makes the mistake in reading the law. And if you can do that, then I think you're starting to get to this idea that judges are constrained by the law, but then they're empowered to make certain decisions based on this bias, what they can get away with within limits. And then you'll see this is called controlling authority and precedent, that this is what sets up kind of a chain of events that can get worse and worse and worse. So law doesn't automatically correct itself. It doesn't change people's behavior, and it can be used in pretty much any way within a very tight, constrained legal system. Again, with those norms, the education, the opposing arguments, right? This is what keeps it from going to do what anything you want to do, but you have quite a bit of what's called malleability. So like a dough, right? You can move Play-Doh around, or dough for bread, right? You can move it around quite a bit. You can't do it unlimited or it'll all fall apart, right? But you can move quite a bit. And so that's how you have to start thinking about it. And then you'll have your final exam review. You'll take the final exam, and then you'll give yourself the grade. And so please, please, please make sure you're looking at this rubric, and this is kind of your last chance, last week or so here, to really think over these things, think about what you've been doing, think about how you need to push past this kind of, what I'm going to keep calling a naive or a beginner's understanding of what you think the legal system is. It's very common. Everybody comes into the classroom with that same idea. But now you've had 6 weeks of information where you should start showing me that you're really understanding it. If you haven't done all the readings, that's maybe one reason, right? I've tried to design these readings and activities to help you get this new information. If you haven't gotten the new information, then it'll be hard for you to change your learning. If you've only read 6 or 7 pages of the reading, it could be the same thing. You need to try to push yourself now, and definitely watch the week in review videos where I try to go over the main points, because those are what's going to be on the final exam. So that's kind of it. It's been very quick, and so this is the last review video I'm doing. and hopefully you will pick up this last week's worth of work, and that'll help you push a little bit further. Do the best you can, and just try to get past that idea that law is one thing and be able to really show me you understand the concepts.